The Democracy Forum is a not-for-profit organisation founded in 2009 under the patronage of Baroness Nicholson of Winterbourne. Its principal goal was to work for the furtherance of democracy, peace and the rule of law in order to counter religious fundamentalism and intolerance in our global communities. In an increasingly fractured world, this goal continues to be the driving force behind all of the Forum's activities. Lord Charles Bruce is the current president of the Forum. Since its inception, the Forum has hosted and co-hosted seminars on a wide variety of topics relating to democracy and human rights across the world. The Democracy Forum encourages academics, students, journalists and other socially and politically conscious people to attend our seminars and to participate in the question and answer session. Details are available on our website, thedemocracyforumlimited.com.
The Democracy Forum brings you another not-to-be-missed webinar, Impact of the Internet on Democracy, Positive Tool, or Polarizing Force. As the Internet becomes an integral source of news and information, slowly replacing traditional forms of media, the Democracy Forum's next seminar will explore its role in relation to democracy. While giving a voice to the previously voiceless, the Internet now also stands accused of spreading misinformation, polarizing electorates and calling the very integrity of elections into question. Has the net transformed from an instrument of democracy into a threat to democracy? How far are global entities and social media companies, each with their own agenda, moderating political content? And what are the implications of online misinformation platforms for democracy? To consider these and related issues, please tune into our live broadcast for a rigorous and stimulating discussion of this current and pressing issue.
Press, to the silo platforms of extremist views, to the phone-led 24-hour news cycle where politicians are constantly playing catch-up, no time to think, to Russian and Chinese troll farms aimed at upending the systems of governance in Western democracies. What a topic we have today. Impact of the Internet on democracy, positive tool or polarizing force? How do you explain, for example, China in a 5-second video slice on TikTok? I am not even going to begin to answer that one because our knowledgeable panel will. Helen Margetts, Andreu Casas, Shannon C. McGregor, and Peter Ferdinand. Cristian Vaccari, who was to be with us, unfortunately can't make it. Democracy Forum Chair Barry Gardiner MP is following the debate and will be and has been on the front line of Britain's parliamentary legislation and discussion about the internet for many years. He will tell us at the end how far we have succeeded or failed in answering the questions under debate. And as always, to give us the canvas and background of our discussion, we go to the president of the Democracy Forum, Lord Charles Bruce. Lord Bruce, the floor is yours.
Welcome to this webinar organised by the Democracy Forum, which will evaluate and assess the impact that digital media has on political discourse in the public space. I'm grateful that the team at Democracy Forum has convened this event to highlight such a vitally important topic. And I'm very glad that such an eminent panel of speakers have been invited to participate. I look forward to hearing their views and the ensuing discussion. And I'm delighted that Humphrey Hawksley has agreed to act as your moderator today. The reach of social media into all corners of everyday life is ubiquitous. Over 300 million new images are uploaded daily on Facebook. Twitter is refreshed every second with 6,000 posts. The most watched channels on YouTube weekly receive more than 14 billion views, while the messaging app Telegram claims 500 million users. There is little doubt that the internet has reshaped the public arena and inevitably, I quote, has led to democratization in content distribution, where information flows have never been faster and less controllable. But the question remains, what does this all mean for the political space? The political scientists Rawls and Simon conclude that the resulting impact of digital media on democratic institutions amounts to an era of disruption and turbulence. Research published by the Oxford Internet Institute clearly demonstrates that the manipulation of public opinion over social media indeed remains a critical threat to democracy. In 81 countries, the Institute found evidence that, I quote, social media is utilized to spread computational propaganda and disinformation about politics. And specifically, the Institute has found 4 distinct types of malevolent messaging used in cyber campaigning: pro-government or pro-party propaganda, attacking the opposition or mounting a smear campaign, suppressing participation through trolling or harassment, and the use of narratives to drive division and polarize citizens. Responding to the Online Harms White Paper published by the UK government in 2019, the Carnegie UK Trust, supported by 6 other concerned NGOs, summarized the existential risk to civil society which this type of internet activity represents. I quote, "Along with terrorism, extremism, and the exploitation and abuse of children," it observed, the white paper highlights several threats which can be grouped together as 3 threats to democracy in the United Kingdom: viral disinformation, manipulation of the information environment, and online abuse. They inhibit democratic engagement, corrode civil responsibility, corrupt political discussion, and put at risk those who take part in public debate. Perhaps the most insidious threat that the internet poses to the stability of civil society is exposed by the writer James Williams in his polemical essay, Stand Out of Our Light, which examines the unconscionable impact represented by the sheer volume of digital media that people freely consume, an infinite appetite for distraction, characterizing this increasingly intractable aspect of contemporary life as the daily tension of existence, which he describes as freedom and the attention economy. Williams enlists the 19th century philosopher John Stuart Mill, whose treatise on liberty explains, I quote, "the appropriate region of human liberty, comprising first the inward domain of consciousness, liberty of thought and feeling, absolute freedom of opinion and sentiment on all subjects, practical or speculative." And Williams suggests that our generation risks losing, I quote, "the freedom of the mind, the first freedom upon which freedom of expression depends," thus threatening the integrity of Article 21 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, where, I quote, "the will of the people shall be the basis of the authority of government." What is at stake clearly are the ethics of communication, or more precisely, the way in which politicians communicate with their electors. In 2007, Tony Blair used one of his final speeches as Prime Minister to express concern about the compulsive and overwhelming relationship between politicians and the media, and the inherent cynicism that it bred in voters' minds. I quote, "A vast aspect of our jobs today is coping with the media, its sheer scale, weight, and hyperactivity," he stated. But the real reason for cynicism is precisely the way politics and the media today interact. 10 years later, in 2016, the degree of interference of social media in the functioning of democracy was painfully exposed in the United States presidential election and the UK referendum on leaving the European Union. Commenting on the systemic impact on democratic traditions on both sides of the Atlantic, the journalist Carol Cadwalder wrote, I quote, "We have been through the equivalent of a social media pandemic, an unstoppable contagion, that has sickened our information space, infected our public discourse, silently and invisibly subverted our electoral systems. It's no longer about if this will happen all over again. Of course it will. It hasn't stopped. The question is whether our political systems, society, democracy will survive, can survive the age of Facebook. The writer James Williams concludes, I quote, "The liberation of human attention may be the defining moral and political struggle of our time. Its success is prerequisite for the success of virtually all other struggles. We therefore have an obligation to rewire this system of intelligent adversarial persuasion before it rewires us. Doing so requires hacking together new ways of talking and thinking about the problem, as well as summoning the courage necessary." So I hope very much that our panel today can give us the courage to confront the unintended consequences of the digital subversion of our lives and offer us a vision of the future where democracy may be strengthened and fortified, and where new ways may be found to channel political turbulence into meaningful and constructive progress. Well, thank you very much for deciding to watch this webinar today. And if you've got any questions or comments, please pass them to the panel through the chair.
Thank you very much, Lord Charles Bruce, for that mind-numbing and mind-boggling figures that you gave us behind each of those posts. And the billions is, of course, an identity, a message, and a will or determination to be heard and seen. Let's see if we can find a way through all this. Our first panelist is Oxford University's Professor Helen Margetts, Director of the Public Policy Programme at the Alan Turing Institute for Data Science and Artificial Intelligence. She is deeply knowledgeable on the relationship between the internet and society, and she sits on the British government's Digital Economy Council and a raft of other advisory bodies. She's written extensively on our topic of debate, and her most recent book is Political Turbulence: How Social Media Shape Collective Action. Positive tool or polarizing force? Helen Margetts, give us your view.
Thank you, and thanks everybody for listening. Well, I'm going to say some things on the positive side. I'm not going to be Pollyanna. I'm not going to say the introduction was all wrong and everything's fine, but I am going to say some positive things. And that in doing that, I am kind of going against the grain to some extent of popular commentary and indeed much of the introduction. In the recent years, we've seen a lot of books called things like The End of Democracy, How Democracies Die, Twilight of Democracy, How Social Media Crashed Our Democracy. And there's an increasingly large academic literature on democratic backsliding. And in many of these pessimistic assessments of the current state of democracy, the internet and social media in particular are ascribed some responsibility. And I have to say, perhaps it's partly my job title is and has long been Professor of Society and the Internet. Perhaps it is a spirit that comes in part from hearing the internet blamed on every news item when something bad has happened or some democratic pathology has been revealed, that gives me the spirit of positivity. But let's see whether it's any help in responding to Lord Bruce's plea. So I'm going to do that by breaking the idea of democracy down into its two essential defining characteristics: popular control and political equality of that control. Many political theorists have argued that those are the defining characteristics of democracy. And if we want to kind of somehow measure the standard of democracy that we have, then we should assess it against those two criteria. So starting with popular control, and here I come to my kind of positive point, I want to step back a bit across the short history of the internet and democracy, and to argue that one thing that social media and other digital platforms do including all kinds of digital platforms like those of the New York Times or even the Daily Mail, they allow tiny acts of participation, kind of speech acts, if you like, which in some sense democratize politics. Politics used to be very lumpy. You could only really be active in politics if you had the time and resources to go to long meetings, to tramp the streets, knocking on people's doors, or maybe donate money. All of these things are kind of costly in some sense. And what the internet has done has opened up the possibility of doing very small bits of participation, of political participation, opened up the kind of ladder of participation that we think about at the bottom end. And that means that just by liking something or following a political figure or expressing support for something or expressing concern about something, someone with no more resources than a mobile phone can in some tiny sense fight injustice. And those tiny acts can and have sometimes, usually not, but sometimes scaled up and made a difference. They send a signal to others that support is growing or concern is growing, perhaps about a failing school or hospital. And when things scale up, they catch the attention of policymakers who, one crucial element of popular control is that governments actually listen to people's voices. And actually, internet-based technologies have given policymakers all sorts of new ways to listen to people. They've given us digital services, for example, to which people can respond or comment on or express opinions about. In all kinds of ways, governments and policymakers have more possibilities now to actually listen to citizens and respond to their concerns if they so wish. So in that sense, just in that sense, in terms of citizens speaking and governments listening, the internet has been helpful for the popular control side of democracy. There can be no country in the world that hasn't seen many internet-based, facilitated mobilizations or campaigns for policy change that have demonstrably had an impact in all sorts of ways. So that's popular control. I'm making an argument there that we shouldn't forget that. And I am not saying that everything's perfect, but we shouldn't forget that when we think about the internet and democracy, the idea that it has opened up politics to more and more people. Now turning to the second defining characteristic of democracy, political equality. Lord Bruce mentioned several of the kind of democratic pathologies that have been attributed to the internet. Political hate and abuse, radicalism, extremism, the power of big tech and its ability to shape democratic discourse, echo chambers or filter bubbles of like-minded people reinforcing each other's opinions, and of course, polarization. And polarization, just like those other things, is fundamentally inegalitarian. It works against political equality. It threatens equality with the idea that my view dominates over yours. I'm on this side and it's bigger than your side. So what drives polarization or any of those other things? This comes to the second part of the argument I would like to make, and that is that when we want to know what drives things like polarization or any of the other democratic pathologies we observe, we sometimes need to go back into the history of democracy and look at some of the inbuilt challenges of a democratic system. Say I or you, say I have a crack in my wall. I do actually, it's just over there on the wall over there, and that's what gave me the thought. I see that crack, and I start to worry, does it need painting? Does it need plastering? Perhaps the plaster's cracked. And then I start to think, but is there something more fundamental there? Maybe there's something wrong with the foundations of the house, the neurotic thoughts of a house owner. Perhaps there's subsidence or something like that that's causing that crack. And I think it's like that with democratic systems. When we discover these things which are wrong with them at the moment, we need, as well as thinking about the internet, to think about those kind of fundamental issues with democracy, which have long been there. Because it's in the title of this session, I will turn to, I haven't got time to go into much of this, but say polarization. Let's fasten on that for a second. So what's driving polarization? Well, one argument for the driving of polarization is this question of echo chambers and filter bubbles. And I'm sure we'll talk about those as well as all these other pathologies in the course of the session. There is actually by now quite a lot of evidence that echo chambers and filter bubbles are not really any worse in the general sense, than they are in the offline world. The perfect filter bubble would be just reading the Daily Mail and nothing else, or just watching Fox News for all your news. That would be almost perfect. And you could argue that in a pre-internet era, it was easier to remain in a filter bubble. Today's filter bubbles, it's true that there are lots of cross-cutting ways in which we are drawn to sort of talk to like-minded people, but perhaps there are far more of them. And in fact, evidence suggests that somebody who uses social media is exposed to more news sources, a wider range of opinions than somebody who doesn't use social media. So that's one thing. Humans like echo chambers. We tend to hang out with people like us to work, socialize, entertain ourselves, and so on with people like us. So it's a kind of inbuilt characteristics of human beings, well studied in sociology. And I think it's important to remember that. I don't mean we shouldn't try and do something about it in online settings, but we do need to remember where it comes from. And the same with political parties. I also think that political parties, in some sense, are becoming engines of polarization. Originally, in the original idea of pluralist democracy, for example, but parties were supposed to be bullocks against polarization because they brought different strands of an ideology together, brought sort of people in the same part of the spectrum together. But there are all sorts of inbuilt ways that the ways political parties are designed. For example, the fact that we know from many generations of political thought that activists tend to be more radical than members, who tend to be more radical than supporters, who tend to be more radical than voters. And therefore you get these kind of centripetal forces within parties that can cause all kinds of issues. Parties become factionalized, and actually, as with any of these things, these tendencies, the internet does reinforce that through, I don't know, WhatsApp groups and so on. So that what I'm getting at here is that although the internet does reinforce these tendencies for political parties to pull apart, for example, it isn't necessarily the only driver. And we need to look back at these long-standing tensions of democracy and think about the interaction. So just to finish, what can we do about it? Well, I think it's really important to realize that every single democratic institution, from political parties to electoral regulators to electoral administrators and so on, need to accommodate this huge burst of technology we've had. We are a digital society, and that puts all sorts of pressure on democratic institutions to change, and they haven't been very good at that. Just one tiny example in response to the sort of polarization and political party point. During the run-up to the 2019 election, you had the Brexit Party, only it wasn't a party, acting as a kind of pressure group with a voice in the European Union, campaigning for all the things that the Brexit Party believed, unconstrained by the kind of regulation that applies to parties, because our electoral regulation is very much around parties. Then when the election came, it was able to burst onto the scene as a political party. our system has not dealt well with these questions of regulation and of controlling and shaping the online world. And I think that's what we should be thinking about to respond to these long-running problems with democracy that have been reinforced by internet activity. Thank you.
Helen, Margetts, thank you very much for that. I guess we're taking part in what you call a tiny act of participation this afternoon to do that. I just wanted to ask you, we were talking about it before we went on air, because you're head of the Alan Turing Institute there. Would Alan Turing have been reinstated or rehabilitated, or whatever the word is, without social media? Or was there social media pressure to make that happen?
I'm not head of the Alan Turing Institute.
Oh, sorry, what are you? Director of?
Not to offend the person who is. I'm head of the public policy program.
Okay, right.
Where we use AI for the public good. Well, I think that's a good point. It's a good example. One of the things that, going back to my first point, that social media facilitate is they facilitate a sort of shining of light on injustice and malpractice by governments and so on. And I think you could argue that it was much easier for the government to kind of forget about Alan Turing and the way he was treated by the British state than in the past than it would be now. And behind every sort of reinstatement of a public figure like that, or the highlighting of injustice, you will find some kind of internet-based mobilization, and I think that's important.
And I'd like to feed in. I'm going to feed in. We've got a lot of questions that have come in from our audience, and I'm going to feed them in as we go along. And because we're talking about social media influence and polarization, send it in, polarize us, extremists, bring us together, whatever social media can do. But Ritu Madan asks, and I'll put this to you, Helen, Margetts, with the rise of influencers, what can be done to mitigate the disproportionate bias that they exert?
Well, that's a really good question, because it's a way in which kind of my first positive point works against political equality. In any internet-based or kind of network, the internet is a network of networks, and in any network-based situation like that, you tend to have a sort of power law distribution where some people become incredibly influential, somebody like, I don't know, Ed Sheeran, for example, or Taylor Swift, and then most people are nowhere. And that is something that potentially can be shaped in a political situation. So I don't know, we did a lot of research at one point on digital petitions that were put to the US government and the UK government. And what we found is that, you know, some of those petitions would get millions of supporters, but most of them would become digital dust within 3 hours. 3 hours was a kind of cut-off point. If you haven't got going by then, you weren't going to get going. And I think we have to address questions like that. We have to think what we want, and we have to take the, you know, still millions of people are signing petitions, and maybe you have to look at that data and kind of follow it up and ask more questions and shape which petitions are chosen for public debate, and do some analysis of it by issue area to see what people care about. There's all sorts of ways which you can try and kind of shape that situation. Of course, in the raw, brutal world of makeup advertising or popular music, you know, that's something that it's much more difficult to do. But all the time, those influencers are getting there because of the information environment and the incentives they're set by the social media platforms.
And of course, surely the shining of the light on an unjust cause, for example, for all those that are backing that cause, there is also the other side that is against it. And that's where you get your polarization, isn't it?
Well, yeah, I mean, yes, there will always be people against things. It's not necessarily
that we know about, because you made the very good point before that now we know a lot more and it's much more easier to make your voice heard.
Well, I mean, that's a very good point. So, for example, one of the sources of political inequality in online settings, for example, I believe is hate, and particularly, say, race-based hate, or particularly at the moment, I think, misogyny. And misogynistic hate speech is something that could easily have been going on in darkened rooms before, but now is much easier to carry out. So, it's that interaction between a long-standing problem that like misogyny and its interaction with the technological and the information environment.
So now we know about it and we can stop it. Thank you very much. Please stick with us because we have some really good questions coming from the audience and our panelists. And our next one is Dr. Andreu Casas, a political communications expert at the Royal Holloway University of London, and he's with New York University's Center for Social Media and Politics. His expertise lies in how social movements and interest groups use digital media technology to coordinate actions, gain public support, push their ideas forward, what we've just been talking about. Also, how social media companies moderate content. Andreu Casas, tell us what you know.
Hi, thank you very much for having me. Can you hear me well?
Very well.
I'll get going. Again, thank you very much for inviting me to speak today here at this virtual seminar with this amazing, roster of speakers. I feel honored. And so in the next few minutes, I wanted to address this topic of social media and polarization, and in particular, from an angle focusing on content moderation, basically, and how content moderation by social media platforms can have different effects on polarization. So it's already been said by some of the previous speakers, but I'm just going to reiterate that point as kind of a basis for my argument here, which is that we know that today, compared to some previous years ago, people are increasingly using social media, and not only to interact with friends and family, so not only for their more personal matters, but also to consume information and engage and participate in politics. So basically, social media and social media platforms are becoming crucial in people's political life. I was looking this morning for some numbers for the UK, for example, and I saw that in the latest digital news report from the Reuters Institute, they reported that about 40% of the UK population uses social media to consume news and information. And that number actually goes up to 75% if we include other online sources. Again, this is just an example to bring forward this idea that more and more people are relying on social media for political participation and engagement, and that social media platforms are crucial to their political lives. And that brings me to the main point of what I would like to say during this intervention, which is that we are these days in a sort of a new speech regulation paradigm, in which we have a handful of private social media companies that have a lot of power when it comes to regulating online speech. And if online speech represents such a big part of people's real life, we can also say that they play a key role in regulating speech more generally. And when I say a handful of private media companies, I really mean it, right? If we think about a company like Meta, they own many social media platforms that represent a large proportion of people's social media interactions and online ecosystem, right? They own Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, and so forth. And in this intervention, I would like to emphasize three things that I see as particularly problematic with this new speech regulation paradigm, and then highlight their implications for political polarization. So the first one is that, as I was saying, these companies are private companies. which means that there is a lack of transparency when it comes to their content moderation policies. They do make them public. They do publish sometime information about a set of accounts that they decided to suspend or what kind of content they moderated, but it's this kind of public information that they put out there is very curated. And it's not only that there's this lack of transparency, there is also a lack of independent research that we can do using data from these private social media platforms. So access to independent researchers to these data has been gradually becoming more and more difficult, which what it means for polarization is that it really leaves the door open to many unsustained claims about potential ideological biases in content moderation to go wild, right? If I think about one example that comes to mind is always the conservative groups or Trump supporters in the US, for example, constantly making these claims that big tech is shutting our mouth and that there is some sort of ideological bias when it comes to content moderation by mainstream social media platforms. And these sort of claims are not only made by conservatives or pro-Trump supporters in the US, but by many groups from many different ideologies around the globe. And one reason why these claims keep being there and keep increasing the levels of polarization in our political debates is because of this lack of transparency and because we can not do independent research on these content moderation policies and their effects. And so we cannot really test the extent to which these sort of claims are true or not, or the conditions under which this might be true. Another or a second reason why I think it is particularly problematic, this new speech regulation paradigm that we're in, and especially as it relates to polarization, is that we are in a world in which we have all these social media platforms implementing particular content moderation policies locally, so to say, so on their own platforms. But by doing so, what might be happening here is that we're making the overall social media ecosystem worse off. And let me just go back to an example to see if the second point becomes clear. I was mentioning Donald Trump before, and we are all aware that he was suspended after the last presidential elections in the US on many platforms like Twitter and Facebook and so forth. And the main reason why these platforms decided to do that is to stop Donald Trump from spreading misinformation about the elections. So one could argue that by making that decision, those platforms were making their local or internal ecosystem better because they were stopping certain types of misinformation to go around. However, we know that what happened right after is that Donald Trump went and founded a complete new, different social media platform, in this case, Truth Social. Right? And there is a lot of anecdotal evidence and headlines and news stories about how actually Donald Trump became even more radicalized on that platform. And people were able to find a space where they could make even more polarizing and extreme comments. So again, this to reiterate this idea that we might be sometimes, especially social media platforms, might be obsessed about solving particular problems locally, but actually by doing so, they might be pushing people to other more niche platforms where they might be radicalizing even farther, or maybe people radicalize on other mainstream platforms where they are also active and they are not being suspended or shut down. And a final point that I wanted to bring forward for our discussion in relation to social media and content moderation and polarization. It closely relates to what I was just saying previously, which is that by implementing particular content moderation policies, we might actually be growing the amount and the size of echo chambers that are available on social media platforms. Again, this idea that Trump supporters all fled to Truth Social kind of is already an example of how, you know, people that used to be on the same platform and be exposed to different kinds of opinions from different ideological silos, now they are on their own silo and they become more unaware of other arguments that are out there, increasing the levels of polarization in society. And one other example that I would like to mention here, some of my research on social media content moderation and potential ideological biases and implications looks at kind of the geopolitics of it. And one example that comes to mind regarding potentially growing echo chamber is what's happening these days with the war in Ukraine, right? Where we have many Western governments pushing Western-based social media platforms to ban any state-backed up information that comes from Russia. And I fully understand and I can see the positive side of things here, right? In the sense that what these Western governments and platforms are trying to do is trying to prevent particular pieces of misinformation about the war in Ukraine to circulate among the Western public. And on the other side of the coin, we have Russia exactly doing the same, right? And not allowing particular Western social media platforms to operate in Russia. Again, with the same purpose, to try to avoid Russian population to being exposed to the Western discourses about the war of Ukraine. What I find problematic about this is that, you know, we are growing apart and really not being in touch with the way, for example, from a Western perspective, we are losing touch with the reality that Russian population is being exposed and the narratives that they are being exposed day to day when it comes to the war in Ukraine. And so basically it's getting and becoming more and more complicated to understand the other side, right? If we don't understand where they are coming from, it's really hard to engage in any meaningful conversation to try to reach some sort of consensus, solution, or middle point when it comes to particular policy problems. I think I'm going to stop here. These kind of the main theme I wanted to put forward for our discussion, and these three kind of sub points about when, you know, content moderation by social media platforms can become problematic, especially when it comes to increasing the depolarization out there in our society these days.
Casas, very much for that. So just to encapsulate, and if I've got this right, from going, say, 20 or 30, 40 years ago, that there was a media outlet, whether it was the BBC or something like that, that we all more or less trusted, that is getting divided up more and more, so that now people are even leaving Facebook to start their Rumble, I think is the one that Russell Brand, our celebrity that's under fire at the moment, is on. And that situation has created that we do not, none of us can get an accurate picture of what is happening in Ukraine, because all sides are posting or broadcasting their own view. Is that correct?
Well, I think there are kind of two sub-points in there. The first one is this idea that by not allowing particular, maybe extreme groups to be present in mainstream social media platforms, it means that we are really not stopping them from talking online. They're just going to create some sort of niche platform. Yeah, they are just going somewhere else, which might have big consequences, because these people might actually radicalize even farther. Right. And that brings me to a second point, which is we cannot really test the extent to which that scenario is actually worse than just letting those extreme views staying in mainstream platforms, right? Because there is a counterfactual in which by them staying there and not receiving this additional attention, maybe they would not radicalize even farther, maybe they would not kind of get farther supporters and so forth.
So your view is that they should not be banned or pushed away, they should be allowed?
Well, I think there are theoretical reasons to think that it can go both ways. I think my main point here on top of that is that it's just really hard to do any good research on these topics because it's becoming really, really hard to get access to any data from social media platforms, right? And I think there is, we have some policymakers in the room. So I think there is definitely room for improvement when it comes to trying to build some institutional solution that goes, above these companies and tries to bridge resources from all the companies to find a more global understanding of what's happening and how particular policies can have particular impacts on society.
And could I put an audience question to you before I let you go? Ritesh S. Nigam, as disinformation is moving increasingly towards closed messaging platforms, this is exactly what you've been talking about, how should its spread be monitored? And there's also one similar from Mohit Johri. Is control over the internet's content necessary or desirable? And if so, who should police it? Could you wrap up those two thoughts for us, please?
Yeah, definitely. And let me wrap up maybe with reiterating the point I was making before, which is these are exactly the kind of questions that we researchers are asking ourselves. And we're just having a really hard time testing. And again, there are rationales in favor of things going both ways. So what we should be able to do is to really test these things.
Okay, that's thank you very much. It reminds me, people often talk about this, is when Martin Luther nailed his complaint about the papacy to the door of Wittenberg Church. The printing press had only just been invented. And had the printing press not been invented, would there have ever been a Reformation? We may be in a similar situation now, but we move on to Professor Shannon C. McGregor of the University of North Carolina's Hussman School of Journalism and Media. She has researched deeply into the role of social media and data in political processes with a focus on political communication, journalism, public opinion, and of gender. And she has a counterintuitive view about this so-called polarization caused by social media. Who is actually responsible? Shannon C. McGregor, give us your argument.
Hi, great. Thank you so much for having me. Like the others have said, I'm honored to be a part of this conversation. And I want to say first off that I strongly agree with the points that have been made before, and that everything, the sort of role of social media and democracy is also have done a lot of very good things moving us towards democracy, which I'll talk a little bit about as well. And that also, to answer some of these questions, we urgently need more access to what is happening on platforms so that we can actually, empirically understand what's going on. But given that, our topic today is about whether the internet and social media platforms and being online can move us towards democracy, is it a positive tool or is it this more polarizing force? I guess I want to take a little bit of time and talk about whether we should even be thinking about the polarization aspect of it all the time. So I want to, this is building from a piece that I wrote with my colleague, Daniel Kreis, also here at UNC, in which we argue that a lot of the conclusions of this polarization research, especially as it relates to the internet's role and social media platforms' role in it, are sort of wrong because you can't sacrifice equality and justice and moving towards a democratic society and more democratic society on the altar of social cohesion and of always being together. Any consideration of the harmful effects of polarization must also address the fact that political inequality, especially in the context of, for example, white racial supremacy in the United States, has historically been far greater and more long-lasting destabilizing and anti-democratic effects on our society, especially for those groups in our societies who are not white and not dominant. And so I want to challenge us a little bit to think about that polarization might not actually be bad for democracy. In fact, it might be a necessary outgrowth of our efforts to achieve a true multiracial liberal democracy. So to situate all of this, I want to remind all of us that we have all these sort of different groups in our society that are located in various ways and in various social structures. And that can be things like differences based on our gender, our class, our citizenship status, our religion, in addition, of course, to race and ethnicity. And there's clearly a set of dominant power relations, right, across all of these dimensions. And a functioning democracy, as Helen said earlier, is premised upon equality, right? And so you need political equality, but also a certain degree of social equality in order to be a democratic society. And so when we think about polarization, then our concern should not be that certain groups and their movements to fight for equality may be polarizing. The concern should be that we live in this vastly unequal society. None of this is to say that polarization isn't a thing that we should be concerned about and that it's not potentially harmful for democracies. But instead, that democracies, of course, rely on a widespread political tolerance and perceptions of legitimacy of the opposition to secure commitments to things like a peaceful transfer to power through the ballot box, through people voting. But it is to say that polarization should not be the only thing that we should be worrying about. As we did have an assault, on our nation's capital on January 6th, it was designed to prevent the peaceful transfer of power after a safe and secure election. And that's not a problem of polarization. That's a problem of anti-democratic extremism. It's an unfair and illegitimate power grab by a set of dominant groups in a white-dominated political party. It's not that it's a society or even across our politics that we're so divided. So to ground this, before coming back to the role of platforms in this, I want to talk about a few empirical, normative, and historical critiques of polarization as a lens through which we should think about our democratic ills. Why this obscures a greater threat to democracy, and why our focus on platforms similarly sometimes obscures real threats to democracy. On the empirical level, it is absolutely true that across the US and many other Western democracies, the gap between the political left and the political right is very wide in many areas. But where that is the case, it has often almost entirely been a function of conservatives moving sharply to the right. And so the polarization narrative obscures the fact that on the central issue that's at the core of political conflict, two political ideologies, the left and the right, are very much not the same around their orientation to democracy. In the US, for example, one party is dominated by a white reactionary minority that is rapidly radicalizing against democracy and will not do things like accept the principle of majoritarian rule as a part of democracy. And the other thinks that democracy and constitutional government should be upheld. And if we were to say what that is, that's not polarization. It's extremism and anti-democratic extremism. Thinking about the normative level, making a critique about that, the polarization sort of narrative is something that privileges unity, right? Stability, social cohesion. But it does so over prioritizing social justice or equal participation or equity socially or politically or legally. And it doesn't really grapple with the fact that calls for racial and social justice will inherently be destabilizing to a system that's built on traditional hierarchies around race and gender and religion. Those are polarizing movements often, but they move us closer to democracy. Historically, we've had times of polarization, of course, before, but those have been times of movements towards democracy. So in the US, I think about the civil rights movement and the white backlash it provoked, or even further back in time, the 1860s, not the 1960s, when we had the Civil War and the Reconstruction, which provoked a violent white backlash. So polarization sort of tends to mythologize these eras of consensus and supposed unity, but political consensus, was usually based on an agreement between the sort of left and the right to leave a discriminatory social order intact and deny equal representation to others. So when we think about polarization, it often is abstracted away from these social structures and social differentiation and political power. And so what is the role of platforms in all of this? Do they play a role in polarization? No doubt. I think we have empirical evidence to show that they certainly play a role in it. But I think given the deep roots of social and political identities and the political differences that we have, they likely don't play a primary one. And we know that they can't, because of that, do a whole lot about it. Platforms can't solve for the underlying political problems that are at the root, for example, of polarization and the racial and ethnic divisions that are concerned with things like social power and political power. Platforms can't remove the incentives that political and other leaders have to create and harden social divisions in their pursuit of more political power. And even if platforms did solve for things such as like emotional content, which is often a focus of some of the pleas from researchers in terms of content moderation, as Andreu was discussing earlier, this would also work to the detriment of pro-democratic social movements that utilize things like emotions and moral communication to realize democracy. So it's not really clear why Facebook or other social media platforms should seek to, make content moderation decisions or policy decisions that are trying to decrease polarization, rather than making those decisions based on pursuing and upholding justice and equality and democracy. The same algorithms that many of us decry for polarizing, publics in across different countries, are also the same ones that activists who are struggling for visibility utilize to make things like police violence visible, and provide opportunities for users to challenge racist narratives. So I think it's important for us to ask, why then do polarization and even platforms consume our sort of imaginary when diagnosing our democratic problems, and provide a reliable sort of go-to for both blame and areas where we might intervene in that. For one, polarization online and on social media is really visible. Even though we can't get our hands on all of the data that we would like to study it's still very visible to researchers, to journalists, to politicians, and to citizens. So, for example, the social media-driven Black Lives Matter movement certainly polarized people along political lines, as some adopted the racial equity view of the movement. But so too does the white backlash to movements for racial justice, which is another thing that we observe frequently online. But if we think about it from a healthy democratic perspective, one of those movements brings us closer to a true liberal multiracial democracy, and the other farther from it. So then why should the role of platforms and what they play in polarization be our primary concern? Both of those things, polarization and platforms, have caught on throughout, academia, the press, politicians, as a thing that we can diagnose as causing the democratic decline. But that allows us, I think, to obscure real problems in an appealing, unpolitical way. The polarization concept is useful if you want to lament problems in politics, but you can't bring yourself or can't see that the problem is actually, far right extremity. Polarization seems like something that we can all agree is a problem. It engenders, unanimity. But so does blaming our political ills on social media. So they're both sort of a rather genius way to frame democratic backsliding, providing a sort of language and focus of our lament that blames sort of nobody and everybody. And so in taking up questions then polarization as a concept, it doesn't really provide a way for us to distinguish between things like white supremacists and racial justice activists, despite those two groups having a very different relationship to a liberal democracy. And so when we think about platforms and being online, we think that they should be thinking about solving for democracy and not really solving for polarization, as that won't necessarily get us towards the ideal democracy that we would like to have, I think.
Thank you very much indeed. That is really food for thought in the extremity. That's a 3-course banquet I just had there. So should our title have been, and I'm not going to change it now, positive tool or a tool that encourages illegal something? Because you're talking about the rule of law, aren't you, more than polarization? Or not the rule of law, but encouraging criminal acts.
Right, or encouraging, an orientation that is small d democratic and embracing, a society and a politics that is open to all equally, or encouraging an orientation to that is closing the doors and making us sort of less democratic and less equal.
Yeah, I just wondered if we could speculate, because you mentioned historically, you talked about the assault on capital when social media was in full flow, but there are also those divisive elements in the United States, the Vietnam War, the Civil War, the Civil Rights Movement, and the constant race and Black rights thing. They're all there. They've all happened. They've all been polarized. So has social media really made any difference?
I think it's made a difference in terms, I think, across a few ways. One, in ways that we might think of as, to address the sort of question of the day, in a way that is absolutely can be polarizing, because extreme views, especially anti-democratic ones, can be much more visible, right? And politicians, especially, and other people with power can spread them. But at the same time, social media has been used by some of these movements, like you said, since we've had it. For example, the Black Lives Matter movement. Helen mentioned misogyny, so the Me Too movement, right, have used social media to also raise awareness about those issues, right? And there's been research that has shown how that has helped drive greater representation of, for example, the grievances, that the racial justice movement is trying to get into the press, where that may not have been, the same case in other times. So I think, it's a sort of both and.
But in I mean, going back again, in say that, the 1850s or something, you went into a room of strangers and started talking about slavery, or the 1960s about the Vietnam War. Here, if you go into a room and start talking about Trump, or we here start talking about Brexit, you sort of don't really want to do it, because there are going to be lots of different views around. Would that sort of social situation have changed at all, or would it be pretty much the same because of social media?
I think, right. I think it would be a little bit different, right? Because our media context always shapes how we talk about politics.
Yeah.
But I think, all of those really hard and difficult things to talk about, and that has always been hard for us to do. But I don't think that means we shouldn't do them, of course, to have those difficult conversations and to sort out what type of democracies we want to have.
Right. So it's bringing the polarized forces together to come to something so that everybody can move on. Can I just give you a couple of audience questions? Daksh Kumar: as globally respected news sources stand accused of distorting the truth, and we heard that from Andreu just earlier, what are the consequences of this breakdown of trust for democracy?
Yeah, this is a great question. And we have seen, across the world, a real decline, but this certainly predates.
We seem to have lost Helen. Margetts? Helen, have you gone? Yes, it seems she has. We hope to get her back, because she was about to give us another stunning answer to that question. But we now go to Dr. Peter Ferdinand, Warwick University's emeritus reader in politics and international studies, an expert in Asia, and he edited a book on our topic 23 years ago, when TikTok, X, or Twitter, and even Facebook weren't even invented. It was called The Internet, Democracy and Democratization: Predicting the Transformation of Relations Between the State and Citizen. Today, he asks the most pressing question in this debate: why should people join political parties when they have far more direct impact through social media? Peter Ferdinand, the floor is yours.
Thanks very much, Humphrey. It occurred to me when I was thinking about what I was going to say that if we'd been talking about this kind of subject 20 years ago, it would have been much easier to come up with a positive answer to the question, is the internet a positive tool for democracy? Because we had seen internet actors manage to overthrow previously what seemed to be pretty entrenched authoritarian regimes in Indonesia, the Philippines, and so on. And it was clear that the internet at that time provided an opportunity for political actors who had previously been outside the political system to rise up and overthrow sometimes pretty corrupt and pretty long-lasting dictators. So that's a reminder that the internet is a kind of technology And it doesn't in itself lead to either positive or negative outcomes. It depends on how people use it. And so what I'm going to talk about today is what the impact of the internet as used by different people, different groups, is upon political institutions. As a political scientist, I think that institutions are very important for making democracy work successfully when it works, work in general in any case. And so the question of, does the internet contribute to viable democratic institutions still, I think, is something that we need to address as well. It's not just a question of narratives and of the way people express themselves. It's also what impact does it have upon the political institutions that exist in democracies, and to what extent might it help to create new ones which are better adapted to modern conditions. Now, the problem for democracy now in the West, Western countries, is that the default narrative tends to be much more about disintermediation, direct involvement in politics. That's what people, individual activists, tend to encourage. They don't, by and large, talk much about the need to make representative democracy better in some way. They want to go on beyond that to something else, whatever that might be. There was a book published in Italy recently by someone close to the Five-Star Movement with the title Democrazia diretta ora, direct democracy now. And that tends to be the underlying motivation for a lot of the people who are most prominent in writing about democracy, even though they might not be quite so clear about what precisely it is that they want to achieve in terms of institutions. And with that also goes a general tendency to be anti-parties, because parties are part of the mediation between the public and decision makers in government. So the narrative tends to focus more upon trying to confine, even do away with, political parties as an obstacle to genuine, authentic democracy. And in practice, of course, what we've also seen is the rise of a kind of anti-politicians, anti-establishment language. Sometimes it's weird, sometimes it's peculiar, but sometimes it's denigration, sometimes it's mocking, or worse. And it seems to me that this is one of the things that really would discourage people from wanting to take part in politics now. Why bother with all of the aggravation of being a party member, a traditional party member, if you can make much more of an impact upon policy by publishing a tweet or organizing a platform on which people might then, like-minded people, might follow you. And actually, I think Mr. Gardiner is going to talk at the end to sum up this discussion. I'd be interested in knowing whether he thinks, based on his experience as a politician, whether that has had an impact upon the readiness of people to take part in politics as we have traditionally understood it. So for the rest of the talk, what I'm going to do is concentrate upon two case studies to exemplify, on the one hand, a possible negative consequence of the internet for democracy, and on the other, a more positive one. The negative one is Italy, the positive one is Taiwan. And I'll try and keep my comments fairly brief because these are whole political systems and we don't have time to talk about all of their strengths and shortcomings. But in Italy, the basic question that we'd want to address is, has the rise of parties or groups such as the Five-Star Movement in Italy done anything to contribute to the establishment of a new kind of democracy there? remember, after 1994, the traditional Italian political system really collapsed with the demise of the Communist Party on the one hand and the Christian Democrat Party on the other. And since then, organized politics in Italy has been pretty turbulent as individuals and groups try to promote themselves as leaders for a new democracy, for a new Italy. And one of the most prominent examples of that was the Five Star Movement, which was created in 2009 by the really two people, the comedian Beppe Grillo and an internet activist called Roberto Casaleggio. And what they did was develop a powerful political movement, which was really it seemed almost anything. It was anti-politics, it was anti-traditional democracy, it was anti-parties, it was anti the establishment. They organized, it wasn't always online, but it was partly online. They organized what were called V-Days. V-Days in Italian was short for basically telling politicians where they could or should go. And so it was trying to undermine traditional institutions on behalf of the people. Grillo presented himself as the megaphone of the people, whose main function was not to propose many policies or ideas for the public himself, but really to channel the views that came from the public towards decision makers wherever they could be found. So it was very much an anti-elite kind of movement, and it created its own online platform, the Russo platform, which was intended to provide opportunities for all party members, and it became a lot easier to join a party. You didn't have to join that party. You didn't have to be you didn't have to pay party membership dues, for instance. You simply had to sign up for it. So the gap between being a political party, as traditionally understood, and an interest group became much thinner. So the idea was then that the party should encourage full-line debate between its members as a way of laying the basis for a new political democracy in Italy. And the general tone of the politics there became very anti-establishment more generally. The man who became, first of all, leader and then prime minister, but leader of the Democratic Party, Matteo Renzi, presented himself then in response to the Five Star Movement as the rottamatore of political institutions. In other words, he was going to scrap them if he came to power. Since then, politics in Italy has been in a fair amount of turmoil. Some would say that's not unusual, but it's certainly the case that the use of the internet by the Five Star Movement and then its imitation by other groups, parties, has contributed to a weakening of institutions without the re-establishment of any kind of viable alternative. And even the book that I mentioned to you before, the manifesto for the Five Star Movement, which talked in terms of direct democracy, really focuses on providing opportunities for the people to make their voice authentically heard, and nothing more than that. It doesn't have any particular remedies for changing the institutions that already exist, or proposals particularly for the alternatives that might replace them. So that's the kind of negative impact that the internet can have upon democracies. Now let me turn to the more positive one, which is Taiwan. And before I talk about democracy in Taiwan and the internet there, let me just emphasize that Taiwan could be a very polarized society. It was under the surface in the 1970s and 1980s, very polarized between those who came from the mainland around 1949, the while I run, and those who came from Taiwan proper, so to speak, because it was the outsiders who had dominated politics, who had run martial law, and who had arrested their opponents, even on occasion had them executed. So the history of relations between those two communities was pretty heated. And when democracy started after 1987, it certainly led to the emergence of two main political parties, the Democratic Progressive Party and the Kuomintang, the traditional party that had run the country since 1949. And although the relations between them are a bit less heated than they were, they still are pretty intense, because basically what divides them is the issue of whether they should, how they should respond to China's pressure for reintegration, as the PRC would put it, or the takeover, as the most Taiwanese would put it. So there's the basis for a very polarized politics there. Society is very digitally savvy, so people could use platforms to exacerbate divisions between political groups. And even if the distinction between the outsiders, the insiders is no longer as valid as it was, it's still the case that linguistically, about 50% of the population there speak Mandarin, or Putonghua, whilst the remaining 50% speak other languages, whether it's Minnan or Hakka or Aboriginal, people who don't come from a, in quotes, Han Chinese background at all. So it would be reasonable to assume that the politics there could become as polarized now as it seems to be becoming in other parts of the world. But that doesn't seem to have been the case yet. Nothing's determined, nothing's definite, but it doesn't seem to be the case yet. And the main reason that I want to point to as being at least a major factor that contributes to it is that since 2016, the Democratic Progressive Party in power, Tsai Ing-wen as the president, has tried to promote the use of digital technology as a way of opening up political spaces and encouraging political debate and constructive political decisions, rather than encouraging political division. This is exemplified by the appointment of Audrey Tang as the Minister for Digital Technology in the DPP administration. And she has become a kind of poster person for digital politics in Taiwan. And she certainly is a very unusual person, being a transgender conservative anarchist former hacker turned minister. What she has done is develop policies and to some extent institutions that try to use the internet and digital technology to provide new opportunities for people to take part in decision making. Although she's the party, so she's the minister in the DPP administration, the party isn't simply trying to promote its cause at the expense of its rival. So she's created a public digital innovation space, which is attached to the cabinet, intended to explore ways in which digital politics might become more integrated into policy making. There's a social innovation lab, which is intended to encourage new ideas from people from the technological community. She's created a virtual Taiwan, a join platform, which was intended to facilitate e-petitions from citizens, and also the GovZero platform, which is intended both to provide links between individual ministries and the public, and also to provide opportunities for the public to make proposals, suggestions to official bodies and expect a response. Now, I don't want to suggest that any of these ideas are unique to Taiwan, because they're not, by and large. The ideas for e-petitions came from originally the United States, for instance. So it's not that Taiwan, so to speak, initiated them, but it incubated them in a way that is a bit different from many other countries. And in particular, what it tried to do was to incorporate into a strategy of the Democratic Progressive Party of developing deliberative democracy as a supplement to traditional democracy in Taiwan, traditional party politics, the legislative UN, and so on, to find ways, new ways, of incorporating opportunities for decisions to be made which seem to come directly from below, certainly that seem to reflect greater willingness on the part of the Parliament and of the administration to listen to people rather than simply to impose decisions on them, even though, of course, it could be said that the decisions were made after democratic elections had taken place previously. So it was trying to create the impression, and to some extent the substance as well, of being a listening government rather than anything else. And one of the things that has developed over the past few years as well has been the use of the internet to enable individuals to take part in local decision making about budgeting in local authorities. All cities in Taiwan now have participatory budgetary arrangements where proposals for the spending of public money, even if they are initially formulated by democratically elected representatives, then get put to greater assessment by groups of ordinary citizens, those who have the time and the willingness to take part in those kinds of debates. It doesn't mean that Taiwan has direct democracy in the way that the Five Star Movement would hope or encourage, but it does mean that there is a greater sense of involvement, willingness to involve people, more people, in the decisions that may affect their lives. So, for instance, in the city of Taipei, which has about 2.5 million people, the last figures I saw for the participation in the participatory budgetary arrangements, which is 2018, were about 101,000 people voted on a set of proposals about how public money should be spent. That's only, of course, about 4% of the total population, but it's an awful lot more than the numbers of representatives who sit in the Taipei City Hall as representing whether the DPP or the Kuomintang or any other party. So that's the main point that I want to leave you with. That is that this participatory democracy is an example of attempts to actually explore new ways of expanding democracy rather than just restricting things to what might be thought of as being the traditional political process. And in that sense, it seems to be working to a significant extent. According to the latest version of the World Values Survey, one of the questions that people are asked in various countries was, how democratically do you think your country is run? Well, and it was on a scale of 1 to 10, where 1 is undemocratic, 10 is completely democratic. The figures for the United States were, the mean rather, was 6.05. The mean for the United Kingdom was 6.56. The mean for Taiwan was 7.37. That doesn't mean to say that people there think that the people who live in Taiwan think that the system is completely democratic, but it does suggest a level of satisfaction that surpasses that of the United Kingdom or the United States. You might be interested to ask the question, and what about Italy in that case? Unfortunately, Italy doesn't seem to have taken part in the World Values Service since 2005. But in 2005, the figure for Taiwan was 5.79. In other words, lower than the figures in the United Kingdom and the United States and Taiwan now. And I don't expect that those figures have got any better in the intervening 20 years. Thanks.
Thank you very much. This idea of having a charismatic minister filled with initiatives and a specific direction and where they want to go to in the digital world, in the social media world. This is not something that we have, I think, in the United Kingdom or in the United States. Would it work with such a figure here?
Well, it would depend upon that person having the political support of some party to start with, I would think. So it would depend upon the party being willing to put up with possibly some of the pain that go with it. But it would have at least the totemic significance of appearing to be willing to adapt the political system to the 21st century in a way that younger generations could relate to.
And but so far, as far as I'm aware, but tell me if I'm wrong, is that neither the governments have appointed such a figure with the power, authority, and backing to do such a thing, or to try to do such a thing.
It would seem that is the case. Yes.
Yeah, I'd like to. Sorry, go on.
But I mean, and it helps a bit that even before 2014. The whole of this initiative for trying to appoint a minister for digital affairs emerged out of the protests of 2014, the Sunflower Movement, when it seemed as though young people were being forced into some kind of deal with the People's Republic, which they basically rejected. And so it already began with the Kuomintang looking for some kind of way of winning over young people to official policies, but it got accelerated with the election of the DPP in 2016 and the appointment of Audrey Tang fairly soon afterwards as this minister.
Yeah. And of course, if such a minister was appointed here in the UK, there would be immediate criticism on our mainstream media or what he or she or they were doing. And why they were doing it. Nate Hyatt has a question here, which I think, what are the mechanisms might explain that local policies can worsen the global information ecosystem? Is it mostly banning high-profile users with an accompanying exodus of their followers? I'm thinking maybe Nigel Farage and the way he was debanked, or some of these people that are on YouTube and have been banned from the mainstream ones. Is this an issue?
Well, it's certainly potentially an issue, but of course, the reverse of that is that what has happened in Taiwan is that the policies have been mainly promoted in practice at the local level, so that it's actually wanting to find ways in which local democracy can work better. And heaven knows, this country could do with better local democracy, greater involvement of people in it. So it's starting by making change from the bottom, as with some kind of, at least, if not direct democracy, then at least less mediated democracy would be a start. How that will be translated to a national level is an enormous question, and that's beyond Taiwan at the moment. But at least a start could be made, and it would symbolize a willingness to change.
And of course, Taiwan, I think, is a more homogenous society Confucian-based East Asian, whatever you want to call it, whereas the cut and thrust of European debate is not as prevalent there?
Well, I hear what you say, but I think you can overestimate the degree of homogeneity of the Taiwanese population.
I'm glad you said that.
Those who came from the mainland and their successors, the generation, people who mainly speak Putonghua, and those who came from Taiwan who feel that they've always been overwhelmed by their big brother on the mainland. So politics in Taiwan can be extremely divisive. If you've ever seen politicians throw in the Legislative Yuan,
indeed, yes,
at each other out of desperation or frustration, then that's unparliamentary practice that would not be accepted in this country.
Thank you for that. I'd like to briefly bring back in Shannon McGregor, who had begun to answer the question from Daksh Kumar. As globally respected news sources stand accused of distorting the truth, what are the consequences of this breakdown of trust for democracy? Give us a nub answer for that, Shannon, please.
Yes, and sorry, my whole browser restarted, and I don't know why, but I'm back. I think, that we've seen this breakdown of trust in all sorts of institutions, including the press, and that in some ways has been exacerbated by social media, but certainly predates it. Right? We've seen this going on for a long time. And so if the question is about the sort of implications of this, one of them is a shared basis of reality, right? And of truth, of not accepting facts as facts if we're not trusting the people and institutions that bring information to us that we can't experience ourselves.
Yes, I think that is a thing. I would like to, why don't I stay with you, Shannon McGregor, and then I want to go around the whole panel to encompass some thoughts that have come from 2 or 3 of our questions here. I'll use the one from Anand Singh Tomar. To what extent are platforms such as Twitter and Facebook incubators of fake news and propaganda rather than tools for empowerment and social change? Margaret Berry says, what interventions are most effective in combating disinformation? There's a strand coming through here. And Philip Bowman, researchers found that the internet does not reinforce pre-existing political opinion when networks are egalitarian. How can social media networks be made more equal? The strand of this, as you can see, is fake news, bringing it into into an environment that people can trust. Shannon McGregor, give us your thoughts on that, and then I want to go around the panel again on this.
Yeah, I mean, so if we take as the premise that maybe, platform policy should be centered around reinforcing democracy, then we would have, much different regulations around, or, internal, to policy or to platforms, around things like misinformation that can be democratically harmful or harmful to health, right? When we think about COVID. And what happens on most of them is that if you're an important person or a politician saying that, that's not actually moderated in the same way that it would be if you or I, right, were saying something like that. And I think, to the last question in terms of how can, would having a more egalitarian social media help solve some of these problems? In some ways, yes, but I find it hard to imagine an egalitarian social media when we don't have an egalitarian
press
society, right? That's sort of taking place on it, right? Like some people have more power than others in society and politics, et cetera. And that those dynamics are going to continue to play out across whatever media folks are engaging with, whether that's social media or the press, et cetera.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. Helen, Margetts, could you give us your thoughts on that? I am going to go around the panel again to ask them a yes or no on the actual debate topic. But to give us your thoughts. We've heard that the good of social media, the bad of social media, but it seems to me what's coming out of this is that polarization in itself is not a bad thing. It's a matter of bringing it over to a critical mass in the middle. Is that correct?
Oh, well, I would like to violently agree with Shannon. And
Violently agree. I like that. Yes.
very important point she made about, you know, if you question the basis on which a hierarchical society has been kind of developed, for example, through the Me Too movement, then you do inevitably threaten some individuals, and people have written about this. They've called it a sort of cultural backlash, where people feel that a secure position that they had in society is being threatened and they fight against it. So that's a problem with our society. I sort of refuse to blame the internet and social media for that, although I do think that there's things, lots of things that need to be done to respond to the other points that people have been making, and I totally buy into that. But I do think you have a basic problem there, and I sort of, in some cases, I don't want to bring them. I don't want to find a place in the middle so much.
You want the debate to continue. You want all the issues to continue to be discussed.
Well, I want political equality, like anybody like any political scientist that believes in democracy. I want political equality. So I don't like the idea that we have to put up with very high levels of inequality because some people are threatened.
And could I ask you then the question I asked Shannon before about these other big events like the American Civil War, the Civil Rights Movement, Vietnam War, that sort of thing, and the issues that we've had here? Are those debates in society any different because of social media?
Well, they are, but I think a lot of that stems, it's like the point I was making about the Brexit Party and our failure to kind of regulate political parties. Democratic institutions have failed to catch up with all the change that there's been. And this speaks also to Peter's point. The institutions of representative democracy have not done a good job at keeping up with the digital society. So we desperately need change, and things are different because I mean, this is another of the sorts of underlying challenges of democracy. When democracy is first introduced, it's a really radical idea. Democracy is a really radical idea. It's based on the idea of popular control and political equality. That's a really exciting kind of redistributive idea, if you like. But when it's introduced, you get lots of new institutions and you get reform, and it's all great. But then, well, it's not all great. Sorry, I'm simplifying ridiculously. But I mean, you know, there's a lot of radical things happening when a country first transitions to democracy. But then over time, you tend to get stasis, and indeed, in some ways, that's what you're looking for, some kind of stability. But institutions, particularly since the advent of the internet and now artificial intelligence and every new wave of kind of data-driven innovation that comes along, institutions need to accept that the society that they're working with has changed. And that's what I think the problem has been.
Thank you for that. And Andreu, Casas, can I take you back to announcing Tomas' question that started this last round? Twitter, Facebook, fake news and propaganda rather than tools for empowerment and social change. Your thoughts?
I mean, I think that sometimes we overstate how much fake news or misinformation is present in all these platforms. I mean, definitely something that circulates around, and definitely around particular events such as the storm at the Capitol or the previous US elections or during Brexit campaign. But you know, when we look at the data, all the empirical papers that look at the presence of fake news or misinformation on social media, all the results point that, you know, only, again, it's this power law that we constantly see in any social media phenomenon that Helen was mentioning. Really just 1-2% of users who often see fake news or misinformation on social media. So I think it's often overstated by mainstream media and so forth. It's kind of a catchy, hot topic. And actually there is some research saying it's less about fake news being present on social media platforms, but more about the media and people talking about so many fake news being on social media. because that really portrays this view that there are many fake news going around, and it increases the distrust on media more generally and democracy.
So it's being talked about and given more power than it actually has. But Helen mentioned that the Me Too movement, that was propelled by social media. Is that a good or a bad thing?
I mean, I think it's a great thing, right? It's the advantage of social media platforms, as many of the panelists have mentioned, that it really lowers barriers and the costs for these movements that really, have to fight hard against the status quo and the consensus, and to make it to more institutional settings. So it definitely brings new tools to these emerging movements to potentially succeed. And I think, also, I take it back to some of the things that have been said about, sometimes it's less about the thing on itself. So it's less about the platforms, but about the people behave, and people don't behave much differently online versus offline. And sometimes we blame the platform for things that are just very entrenched on people's behavior.
Thank you very much for that. Peter Ferdinand, give us a sum up with your final thoughts on that.
I mean, I think in an ideal world, we'd like to see a consensus emerge on policies that we like. Unfortunately, democracies don't usually work like that, and they work less like that than they used to. We just have to get used to the idea that democracy is a much more noisy, much more rambunctious kind of political system, and live with the consequences, I think. We have to hope that usually, certainly not always, but usually, decisions that are in the interests of the majority of the population are ones that don't. But not always. There are obviously interest groups that may play influence. But that's the kind of system that we've got. And I find it very difficult to say under what circumstances people should not be allowed to express views about politics, provided they are not actually inciting violence. Right. So democracy is a turbulent system, and it's difficult to cope with all of the twists and turns sometimes of how decisions are made. But still, I think it's preferable to something that, say, is like what the Chinese Communist Party practices, which imposes a much greater homogeneity and changes history sometimes as well. Changes the account of history sometimes without anybody objecting. That's not a kind of world. It may be stable for a while. It may be reassuring. It's not a world that I want to live in.
Thank you very much, Peter Ferdinand. And give me in 3 words, because I'm going to go back around the panel now, impact of the internet on democracy, a positive tool or a polarizing force? Which one is it?
It's both. And we have to cope with the consequences. What can I say?
And that's fine. You have to say no more than that. And Andreu, Casas, positive tool or polarizing force? Which one is it?
I think I gotta agree. It all depends on the usage we give it and in which context, right? There is this great paper, I think it was from Molly Roberts, Pablo Barbera, Josh Tucker, and they were basically trying to make sense. How can it be that this social media technology has allowed for all these amazing revolutions and democratizing forces, and at the same time we have a tool that authoritarian regimes use to oppress their population? And really, that's what it is at the end of the day. It's a new communication tool that changes the rules of communication, and conditional on that, different actors adapt and use it for different purposes.
Okay, thank you. And Shannon C. McGregor, positive tool or polarizing force?
Not to be an echo here, but both, and depends on the political power and ideology of who is using it and for what purposes.
All right. And on the balance, a good or a bad thing?
I would say on the balance, it has helped us move towards more equality, and I think that's good despite whatever backlash it has provoked.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much. And Helen, Margetts, a positive tool or polarizing force, and good or a bad thing?
I'd go for positive, but with the proviso that it holds up a mirror to society. That's actually one of the ways it can be positive. But society, and most particularly the institutions of representative democracy, need to look in the mirror.
Lovely. And of course, like the printing press, it's a new piece of technology that we're still learning about. And now, as we draw to the end of our Democracy Forum debate, we bring in the wisdom of our chair, Barry Gardiner, MP, a veteran of the social media and democracy wars. He has been listening in. Before, he had a problem with his microphone. Let us hope he doesn't this time. Barry, what do you make of our discussion? Are you there, Barry? Oh my goodness.
Hear me now?
We do not have Barry Gardiner.
Don't tell me.
Ah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Barry. Thank you.
Sorry, I've had to change over to my phone because for some reason the microphone on my computer isn't working. But I watched you all on the computer and listened to what was a fascinating discussion. Humphrey, you missed it. You missed your cue.
Goodness.
You know, when you said to Peter Ferdinand, so all we need is a charismatic minister filled with initiatives, I thought you were going to give the perfect segue to introducing me, but you flunked it. Look, we started off with Lord Bruce and Mill and the primacy of liberty of thought. You took us to Martin Luther. I have to say that Helen then introduced Professor Pollyanna, as she called it. But I was reminded when you were talking about Gutenberg of Orwell, who of course wrote about the primacy of liberty of thought, when he said, the invention of print, however, made it easier to manipulate public opinion. And film and the radio carried the process further. With the development of television, he said, private life came to an end. Well, God knows what he would have made of the internet, but there we are. So let's go to polarization. And Helen Margetts spoke of the filter bubble. She spoke about the moderation, but the filter bubbles. I think she gave us the quote of the afternoon when she said, just reading the Daily Mail or watching Fox News would be almost perfect. I do assume that she meant in terms of a filter bubble, and rather than in any ethical sense, but there we are. But there was a fascinating question that she touched on, and that was the role of the influencers. And I thought there about the inequity of power, the role of the influencers and how they exercise the power that they have, and the role that shame comes into it. So if an influencer who has 3 million followers thinks that you should have penciled eyebrows or plucked eyebrows, and they don't like my eyebrows because they're not plucked, then they must be right. I must be wrong, and I am shamed into plucking my eyebrows. And of course, there can be influencers which we think are beneficial. Taylor Swift has just signed up, I think, 35,000 people in a couple of hours to register to vote. But the way in which we respond to peer pressure, because that's what it is, an influencer is somebody who has a huge following, a huge backing, and it's that peer pressure that is exercised upon us and actually then limits our liberty to think our own thought because we feel pressurized out of it. She also spoke about the algorithms. Last night I was looking online. My children showed me how to use TikTok. This was some of the research I was doing for this seminar today. And I was looking at rats on TikTok. Now, the algorithm will now know that I have an interest in rats, and principally in how to kill them, because I have one that keeps on coming into my garden. And it will then keep on sending me more of what it assumes that I want to see, namely how to kill rats. If we move on to what Andreu Casas was talking about, because he picked up on the issue of content moderation and companies who had the power in regulating online speech. And I think I'm right in saying that he then said, and therefore most speech. But it's interesting that we think of the way in which we can communicate best and most now as being our communications online. And yes, we can all be horrified when we see mothers pushing prams with looking at their mobile phone, or texting on their mobile phone when they're pushing their prams, not talking to their children. But that's usually because the children themselves are on the mobile phones. And it's become our primary mode of communication. That wonderful Banksy photograph of the lovers embracing, looking over each other's shoulder on their mobile phones. When he spoke of moderation, he of course means editing, and editing has been going on for a very long time, right back to Gutenberg and beyond. And Mohit Jory, I think, put a very important question to him, which, Humphrey, you pushed back at Andreu, and I'm not sure that Andreu gave you I think he dodged the question and said, well, it's hard to do research in this area. What are the links, I wanted to find out, between the open and the closed content? We talk about people getting fragmented into darker and darker chasms on the internet, and the danger of censoring or editing or moderating the internet, but the danger that is creating those chasms. But should we not be looking at the way in which people get sucked down those rabbit holes into those chasms? And shouldn't the moderation actually maybe start there? But I thought Andrea made a very, very positive contribution when he talked about Russia. And really the point I think he was making was, if you don't understand the other side, if you don't ever listen to the other side, because you've pushed it off into those dark chasms, those bubbles, the filter bubbles, if you don't understand the other side, you'll never be able to persuade them. I'm sometimes criticized by some of my colleagues because I go on to GB News. And GB News, for those of you who don't know, it's not quite the equivalent of Fox News in this country, but it's getting in that direction. And I happen not to be a right-wing MP. I'm a member of the Labour Party here. And sometimes my colleagues say to me, well, why do you go on GB News? And I say, well, because the viewers on GB News are the viewers that I need to persuade. I don't need to persuade the readers of The Guardian. I don't need to persuade the left-wing literati. It's those people who watch GB News that I want to most appeal to, and I want to get my message across to them. And I think that was what Andrea was really focusing on when he said this moderation, this pushing out and saying, no, you are unacceptable, we can't listen to you, is really quite a dangerous game. And of course, famously in this country, with the conflict in Northern Ireland, we knew we had to engage with the IRA in order to be able to create peace. And I suppose the same it could be said now of Extinction Rebellion. Sharon, it was a breath of fresh air when she not only spoke of the good things, the democratization of the internet, but actually how polarization in itself, going to the extremes, can actually be a very positive thing for democracy. And it was a really important central contribution, I think, to our debate this afternoon. Stability is not necessarily good. Stability can simply be the entrenchment of injustice. And therefore, when somebody talks about equality and civil rights and human rights, they can be seen as extremists. They are rocking the stability. They are trying to polarize our society. But actually what they're trying to do is they're trying to drag it in a particular direction, which many of us would recognize as a progressive one. So polarization in that sense can be a good thing. And conversely, moderation or editing of that polarization on the internet can be a bad thing. So platforms trying to decrease polarization by moderating content often are blocking social justice and equality or environmental progress. And I like the phrase that she used, let's moderate for democracy and equality, not for polarization. She also talked about trust and the breakdown of trust in democracy. I'm not sure. You can look back a couple of centuries to Hogarth, to Dickens. I remember 30 years ago, before I came into Parliament, I had clients in Italy, and I remember I had just become the mayor of Cambridge, and I was out to dinner with one of my clients in Italy, and proudly told them that I had now been elected as the mayor of Cambridge. And that was the point at which I got no more business from that client, because there was such little trust in democracy in Italy. And Peter Ferdinand explained that brilliantly, I thought, when he spoke about the Five-Star Movement and the question about how we make not democracy better, but he actually put in that important qualifier, how to make representative democracy better. And it seems to me that those who want direct democracy are like the free marketeer who believes that there is perfect information. And people have time to access it and ponder upon it and then come to their judgment. There is not perfect information either in the free market, and that's how the free market is not free, because people use the power of knowledge and the lack of transparency to create inequality. But it's also how a direct democracy can fail. And it seems to me that when you were talking, Peter, about Taiwan, and you talked about 111,000 people participating in the budgetary proposals, which is, not everybody, but it was a heck of a sight more than were in the Parliament. It struck me that the key question was there, but weren't they the people who had time and the willingness to do it? And was it not ever thus with the sharp-elbowed middle class? And that's the way that very often inequalities are perpetuated, because the people who have the leisure, the time to engage in getting the information, in participating, are the ones who then do it to maximize the benefit and the returns to themselves. So I believe in representative democracy because we don't all have the time. But to go back to John Stuart Mill right at the beginning, he, of course, was against universal suffrage, quite simply on the basis that he believed that if we had the universal suffrage, then men, he said, would come to regard the vote as their own personal property and not as their responsibility to be exercised on behalf of the community. Now, God knows they didn't do it then. Sadly, they don't do it now, but it is the ideal, I think, of a representative democracy that we should at least aspire to. Thank you very much.
Very much for that. I wonder, before I let you go, is because we've talked about various measures that should be coming, is there any legislation that's just been through or going through the House regarding the internet in Britain?
There is. There's the online safety bill, Humphrey, I wish I could tell you that I was an aficionado of it, but I'm not on that bill committee, and I have not been ploughing through the clauses line by line, clause by clause, word by word, to make sure that it does what it's supposed to do on the tin. But I know it has caused a lot of conversation and consternation, not only in Parliament, but outside of it.
Yes, I've seen some of the coverage. Well, we'll start a petition which will gather 20 million signatures for you to become the new Secretary for Digital and Social Media.
No, the charismatic minister filled with initiatives, as you so beautifully put it earlier.
on any topic or brief that suits you. Okay, we'll do that for after the election next year, but we are out of time. And what a great debate this has been, and a lot of ground we covered. Thank you to our panelists, Helen Margetts, Andreu Casas, Shannon C. McGregor, and Peter Ferdinand. Thank you, Lord Charles Bruce, for so skillfully giving us your backdrop to this fascinating topic, and Barry Gardner for summing up the debate so well. Our next Democracy Forum debate is Wednesday, October the 18th, Bangladesh's path to global growth. Join us then for an equally stimulating discussion. And until then, from me, Humphrey Hawksley, and the team at the Democracy Forum, thank you for being here, and goodbye. Bye.